The Declaration of Independence is quite possibly one of the greatest political documents ever written. And it becomes easy to take it for granted because we're about to celebrate the 249th anniversary of the United States, or at least the separation of the colonies from England where they became states. But I think when you really look at the principles that were listed in the Declaration of Independence, along with the grievances, along with the justification for independence, it's incredibly powerful. And there's no question that that document, more than any other, really laid out kind of the philosophical underpinning of what the United States was supposed to be. Now, a lot of people will look at it and say, oh, how ironic, somebody talking about individual liberty, who also held slaves at the time. And there's no question that that was a contradiction, but the beauty of the Declaration of Independence is that it was understood to be a contradiction at the time. It was understood to be a contradiction by Thomas Jefferson, but he was still fighting for a higher principle. And what ended up happening over time, and this was something that was predicted, was that either the United States was going to live up to the principles of the Declaration of Independence or it would cease to exist. And what we've seen over time when we've had questions, whether it be with things like civil rights, whether it be with slavery, whether it be with a number of other issues, is the United States has repeatedly, more often than not, chosen to live up to those principles rather than to sink from them. And I think that makes us an incredible country. However, we're at another turning point within U.S. history. I believe we're at a significant turning point in U.S. history where there is a number of people that have a very, very different view of the United States, both from our history as well as our founding, and a very, very different idea for what the United States should look like going forward. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to look at the original Declaration of Independence, and then we're going to ask ourselves, what would a new one potentially look like? As we have these discussions with our fellow countrymen, especially many of our countrymen that apparently don't want to be that anymore. So what would a new Declaration of Independence look like if we were to write it going off of the original example that we've been had? So I'm Nick Freitas. I'm your host of Making the Argument. With me in the studio, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone.
And then, of course, we have our resident historian, political prognosticator, the Oracle of Virginia, Christian Hines. Christian, how are you doing?
I'm doing well.
We're going to see if we can get through this entire episode without Christian trying to declare independence in order to go back to a monarchy. I'm sure he's going to potentially make that argument. But before we get to that, I want to introduce the sponsor of today's show, Live Action. I've done a lot of work with Live Action over the years. I got to tell you right now, if you are looking for one of the premier pro-life organizations in the country, Live Action is it. The amount of work that they do on the cultural space. They don't just do the work in the political side, which is very, very important. They do the work in the cultural space, which is desperately needed. Because again, what we're trying to build is a culture which not only believes that it should not be legal to, kill the innocent unborn, but a culture that thinks it's just absurd that we would ever consider such a thing. And if you look at the sort of work that Live Action has done, if you look at the video content that they've done, if you look at the various podcasting that they've done, as well as all the work they've done within the political space, it's one of the most comprehensive, well put together efforts in order to protect innocent human life I've ever seen. So right now, if you want to join the movement, you can do a monthly gift of $20.25 as a thank you. You will receive a free Live Action mug. That's right. They're going to send this to you. As we all know, I have something of an affinity for my coffee mugs, and this is now officially one of my favorites. So $20.25 as a thank you. You receive a free Live Action mug. You can text Nick to 70723. This is an organization that is definitely worth supporting. I'll give you one other example. I've now spoken at their Young Leadership Conference. They've done it 2 years. The first year, they had about 750 students there, 750 people, roughly between the ages of about 18 to 25 was probably the majority. They did it the next year. They say, gosh, this was so good. 750 students. Let's do it next year. Let's bring speakers. Let's have students do questions. Let's talk about this issue. They doubled it. They doubled it in the space of 1 year. So understand, when you are looking for organizations to donate to that are going to have an impact for the issues and the values that you care about, Live Action is a great option. Go check them out. Again, text Nick 70723. Okay, we're going to get into the Declaration of Independence now. So the Declaration of Independence, if you didn't know, is actually broken down into, it's generally broken down into what they consider like 5 different sections. And that is the preamble, the statement of rights, the list of grievances, the Declaration of Independence, the actual part where they're declaring independence, and the conclusion and signatures. Okay. Now, a lot of times when we hear about the Declaration of Independence, all we get is the preamble and taxation without representation, right? That's the whole scope.
They make it sound like it was just taxes.
Rich white slave owners that didn't want to pay their taxes. I mean, didn't the founders understand how important it was for the roads? Yeah, that's what we're taught in school. That's not the reality. That's not the reality. This is actually a lot more in depth. There was a lot more grievances than just taxation without representation. And so that's what we're going to do today. So we're going to start off first with the preamble. So the preamble starts like this: the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So right off the bat, what they're talking about here is laying out the justification for why independence is necessary. So they're essentially stating what they're about to do, and they're actually acknowledging that when you're going to cut these political bonds that have sustained you, have defined a large part of who you are as a political entity, when you're going to dissolve that, you need to have good reasons for it, right? Not just transient causes, not just I'm upset about something, but there's something that has happened that actually presents an irreconcilable difference. Right, there are two different courses that are about to be charted, and they go in opposite directions, and there's no way that this can be reconciled. And it's important to understand that when you look at the early portions, when you look at the First Continental Congress, they did not get together for the purpose of independence. It was a redress of grievances to the crown. You even had this with the Second Continental Congress. When that came into effect, now we started to see serious discussions about independence. But originally, it was trying to address what they call the various intolerable acts. So you had the Stamp Act, you had the Tea Act, right? You had all these various things that were taking place, which the citizens of the 13 colonies saw as infringements upon their rights as natural-born Englishmen, right? So the first step in this entire process was not, we're mad about taxes, so we're going to form our own country. Or countries would have been a more appropriate way to put it back then. It was, no, we think that the British Crown is doing things which are in violation of the various principles which we've come to appreciate about things like English common law or Magna Carta. And we're going to get into the grievances, and they lay them out. So it's important to understand that this was not just a bunch of hot-headed people that decided they didn't want to pay taxes, right? They had reasons, but they are making this statement right off the bat to say that, look, we understand that what we're doing is significant, and it should not be done lightly. And so we're about to list out our reasons for this
in a document in order for posterity, because one of the things that you have happen to a lot of movements, like this may have started as a certain type of movement. Typically what you see is everybody has different ideas about why, and they have different things that sort of compel them to get on board. And so they need to have a comprehensive list of grievances laid out and a mission going forward, because otherwise you end up with mission creep, you end up with fighting within the factions, and then you can't get it done. And so the fact that they committed it to a document and basically laid it out to say, here it is, these are the parameters, these are the grievances, and that way everybody had their input into that.
Well, and you got to understand, like Lexington and Concord had already taken place. The Battle of Bunker Hill had already taken place. Like the formation of the Continental Army, I think some people have this idea in their head that we declared independence, then we formed a Continental Army, and then George Washington became general, and then we fought the British. Nope. You had Lexington and Concord. So you had this clash of arms. You had the Battle of Bunker Hill. You had the formation of a Continental Army, which was basically the unification of the various militias from the various states that were contributing to go up and support the Massachusetts militia. You had George Washington put his head of that, which, by the way, was a very, very strategic move on John Adams' part, because originally the Massachusetts people were the ones that were far more far more leaning toward independence originally. The southern colonies did not like the idea of independence. South Carolina was very much against it. New York did not like the concept of independence initially. Like there was a lot of problems with this. And for John Adams to not recommend a Massachusetts man to lead the Continental Army, but a Virginian was a strategic political move. It also made sense because out of everyone in the Continental Congress, the person that had the most professional military experience at that point was George Washington, although there was a lot of problems at Fort Necessity, other things that had taken place. But that gives you a little bit of backdrop on what was actually going on before they were writing the Declaration of Independence.
I want to add one more thing to this, and I know this is probably going to be a long conversation, this episode, just because it's such a special topic, but it's worth remembering that the American Revolution is very different than many other revolutions that have taken place since, or in some cases before. There was this book written in the 1930s by Crane Brinton called The Anatomy of Revolution, and he looked at 5 revolutions in history: the English Revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, 4 revolutions, and the last one being the Russian Revolution. And he pointed out that the American Revolution took a very different course than those other 3. And largely, it's because if you actually look at it, in many respects, it's not a revolution, it's a restoration. It's a very conservative, restricted vision. They are, unlike in the French and Russian revolutions, the American revolutionaries, the patriots, are not looking to build a new man, right?
Yeah.
The French Revolution is about, we're going to make a new man and the rational Enlightenment vision, and we're going to, start the calendar over and create a new religion. And in the Russian Revolution, you have the same thing, in fact, on steroids, right? It's the new Soviet man, the faceless mask man of the Soviet state. Like, those are very tyrannical visions when they're taken to their logical conclusion, because if you're going to remake humanity, you need a very powerful, omnipotent state, basically, to remake mankind. But the American Revolution is not about that. You hinted at this earlier, that it's actually about a reclaiming of English liberty, which arguably goes all the way back to the Magna Carta. I would actually argue it goes back even before the Magna Carta. And so the object, like, obviously the end result is a complete political reshaping of the country. But in terms of social, cultural, economic, political arrangements outside of, like, replacing a monarchy with a republic, what they're trying to do is actually restore many of the same privileges and rights and ways of being that had previously been in place. And that's just really important to remember, because most revolutions are leftist revolutions. The American Revolution is a conservative restoration of liberty that had previously existed, that they felt like was being taken away from them.
And I would agree with that, combined with, again, the restructuring of government, which became a question more later on, right? Because, again, people forget that the Articles of Confederation gave very, very little power to any sort of what we might call national or federal apparatus, which is why again that ended up being changed later. But okay, let's get back to the Declaration here. So we have that first laying out of why are we doing this in the first place. The next one is we might call the Statement of Principles, right? So this is the part where you get into this idea of the philosophical underpinning for why they're doing. They just told you what they're about to do. Now they're going to tell you why they're doing it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's probably the most common refrain within the Declaration of Independence that most people know. And again, we look at it now, we take this for granted. This would have been considered absurd in almost anywhere in the world, right? With the possible exception of maybe the Netherlands or England itself.
Maybe
right?
Switzerland at the time.
Switzerland, yeah, a couple of the countries. So this really was kind of a revolutionary concept. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Again, this is a rebellion against the divine right of kings. This is the idea that no, governments are established not because somebody conquered you, not because the king gets to decide. They're established to secure rights, God-given rights, right? And their just powers are from the consent of the governed. So it's the representative component. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem the most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Now, this is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, they're asserting the right of the people to overthrow a government. Why? Once it becomes destructive to the ends that they've already mentioned, what they have established as the just ends, right? So it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is a God-given right. Governments are established to secure those rights and to facilitate people being able to pursue those things. The governments which are become destructive to those ends must be altered or abolished. All right. Let me see. Yeah, safety or happiness. Okay. Prudence. Now, one other thing. Laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form. Now, what's interesting about this is this doesn't say, therefore you have a republic. It says organizing its powers in such form. So it's leaving a little something open here for how a government can be organized in order to achieve these necessary ends. All right. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light or transient causes. And accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. This is very critical because this goes into kind of the Burkean conservative notion of this idea. And this is also where you see this kind of big difference between the French Revolution and the American Revolution. What he's saying here is that it is provided, like, no government's perfect. No government's perfect. They're going to make mistakes. And insofar as the mistakes are minor, right? Or insofar as the mistakes are not damaging or destructive to the essentials, then it's probably better, or most people are inclined to stick with the current form of government rather to seek out a new one, right? That's the whole transient purposes. And again, you got to remember, they had just received back, they had sent the Olive Branch petition over to King George. And the Olive Branch petition was pushed by members of the Continental Congress who did not want independence, who did not want to go to war. They wanted to calm things down. They wanted to reassert to King George that they were loyal British subjects. They just wanted a redress of grievances. And King George essentially came back with tough, and for those of you who do not repent immediately, you'll be hanged. Right? Like in any sort of like what we might call the anti-independence, even though that's probably not the best way to put it, but anti-independence, anti-war movement within the Continental Congress was crushed upon receiving King George's response to the Olive Branch petition. And then it goes on. So abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. That's that coming back with the, like, we asked, we tried to reconcile, we tried to do a redress of grievances. You would not entertain that. You threatened us. And since we are looking at this long train of abuses, we now have a pattern of behavior over time, which is suggesting to us that there is no way to get a proper redress under the current form of government. Now we have not only the right, but the duty, right? That's a significant change here. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having a direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. And now they move into to provide this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. So once again, within this preamble, they've actually laid out a philosophical underpinning of what constitutes a just state. And it is a, I won't say it's not a massive departure from the English tradition, because so much of it is built on components of the English tradition, components of the Enlightenment, John Locke in the two treatises of government. Like you had already started to see this battle taking place in England, especially when you have, like, bad King John, and you have the establishment of the Magna Carta, where now all of a sudden it tears away this idea of the monarch being an absolute monarch.
And that's settled during the English Civil War.
Yes.
Which also ended badly, but eventually led to a restoration under Charles II. And from that point on, there's this idea of the supremacy of Parliament. So it's the crown in Parliament is what's ruling. And that kind of solidifies what we kind of call English liberty.
Yeah.
Because after Charles II, eventually at the end of that of the 17th century, this is the 1600s, you get the Glorious Revolution.
Yeah.
And James is kicked out. He's trying to, in some ways, be, you know, they kind of are upset that he's Catholic, but really what they're upset about is that he's trying to transform the country into a French-style monarchy, almost like an absolute state under like Louis XIV, the Sun King. And so then they bring in William and Mary, and then you get John Locke writing his kind of justification for what had happened. And, you know, across the pond, Carl Benjamin once said not too long ago that liberalism is English, or is Sharia law for the English. And when he said that, I laughed so hard because in many respects, it's actually true if you look at history. But by that same token, you could argue that libertarianism is the American variant of English liberalism. It's Sharia law for us. Now,
well, and when we say Sharia law, let's just clarify what we mean by that is that you have something that has, it is so inherent to the cultural norms of a particular people.
It's fundamental to the identity.
That to obey it seems natural, right? So if you're a Muslim leading in Saudi Arabia, of course Sharia law. This is not something that's just imposed on you arbitrarily by the government. It's a core component of what your identity is living within that culture. It's very similar to what you just described for both the English when we look at common law and Magna Carta, and then in the United States when we look at the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, right? There's certain concepts here which inform the way we think about government and law that is so inherent to our nature that to attempt to significantly alter it is to fundamentally change the identity of what it means to be an American.
And this is why the founders wrote the things that they wrote. Now, what's also important, and this gets back into a lot of the longer conversations we've had over the past couple of years. There's a part in here, and I want to highlight this because you get a lot of people that miss this. They are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Because if you remove this, well, then you create the Rawlsian comprehensive liberalism, because then you can get people saying, oh, well, my pursuit of happiness is walking around the streets of San Francisco naked and transing kids.
Yes.
And there's no obligation to anybody else because it's just me. It's just atomized individualism.
It is important. Anybody that believes that the United States was set up as a purely secular country has no idea, not just about what the Declaration said or even some of the debates regarding the Constitution, but what state constitutions said. All right, we were never set up as this purely secular entity. And I think it's important to understand that. Like they believe that God actually provided a foundation for objective morality and objective truth, and that could be appealed to, just like it was in the Declaration of Independence. So now we get into the list of grievances, and this is the part that is probably, I think, the least understood by your average public school child in America when it comes to why did we separate.
Oh, it's just taxation without representation.
It's just taxation without representation. It's all the economic view of the world.
It's all the evil, rich, white slave owners didn't want to pay their taxes.
And
right?
and they equate it even smaller than that. They're like, it was a tax on tea they were all mad about.
Yeah,
and then
stupid.
It was all over tea. And it's like, no.
So we're gonna go through these briefly, because again, the question we're gonna get to at the end of all this is, do we need a new Declaration of Independence with respect to the way the country is going? So we're gonna look at what grievances informed the original. He has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. Here's what you need to understand. You had legislatures. You had the equivalent of colonial legislatures, which had historically created the laws that would govern them. They still had English law, right? And it was informed by that. And the crown was still supreme, but they were largely left to be able to handle, the significant issue, the day-to-day issues governing life within the colonies. That started to change later on as all of a sudden, the king was trying to reassert dominance over the colonies. So when they say he has refused to his assent to laws, what that means is that they would try to come up with laws to govern themselves that they felt were necessary in order to just manage civic life, commercial life, etc. And he wouldn't give assent to them. So they were essentially ineffective. They couldn't do anything. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend them. So he's saying, like, okay, not only will he allow our legislators to do it, but even his own governors that have authority, they're not allowed to do this as well. So he's essentially making it impossible for us to govern ourselves. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. Again, it's kind of similar theme here, right? He's making it impossible for the colonies to govern themselves. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. So this is one of those things where we might call it almost a form of malicious compliance. So what the King of England was essentially doing now, he's saying, oh, no, I'm not preventing you from doing this stuff, but if you want to do it, you have to do it tomorrow 500 miles away from where you live. Okay, well, that's, again, I'm exaggerating here, but I'm providing an example of how someone would say, oh, no, I have not denied you this right, but I've made it impossible for you to effectively exercise it. And so, again, it's another example of him making the colonies ungovernable. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. So that was, yes, you can govern yourself, but the moment you do something I don't like, I will dissolve it. Can you really govern yourselves then? He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers incapable of annihilation have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions from within. Once again, he has endeavored to prevent the population of these states for the purpose of obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. A lot of this, too, had to do with problems with respect to when the English had fought the French and Indian War, they had attempted to establish like a far west border, and people were not allowed to go beyond that. It caused issues when people wanted to settle beyond it. Some of that had to do with treaties with tribes and things of that nature. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. So again, the crown also had to bless off on the court system. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount of payment of their salaries. This is another way to control the judiciary, right? If you can't be a judge unless I say, and then I get to say how long, and I get to say how much you make, well, how often are you going to rule against the crown? Never, right? He has kept among us, he has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance.
Sounds familiar.
That is, you know what another word for that is?
Bureaucracy.
Another word for that is bureaucracy. So look at this.
That's 80,000 IRS agents.
Yeah. That is, we can't afford a new tax cut, but we can afford 80,000 new IRS agents. So keep in mind, everything up until that point, right? If you look at everything else he talked about, it was all about the various things the King of England had done to make it difficult or impossible for the individual colonies to be able to govern themselves. This next one was and now what he's doing is he's creating this horrible bureaucracy, right, which harasses us, right? So think of the local inspector showing up all the time and eats out their substance. It's like, did you do the tax on that? Does that have a stamp on it? What about this? Did you do the tax on that? Are you allowed to sell that? Okay, sound familiar? He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has effected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. What that had to do with was that they brought in, so they had English troops in the colonies that were there to essentially enforce the king's will, and then he made the military independent and superior to civil power. So essentially, he was removing the various mechanisms that were in place to hold the military accountable. You saw this as an example with after the Boston Massacre. So interestingly enough, just for perspective here, John Adams actually defended the crown during the Boston Massacre, and he won. The four members of the British military that were tried for it, 4 or 5, were actually found not guilty. But after that, the king actually said that British military personnel would no longer be subject to the courts within the colonies. So that's part of what he's talking about here with render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation.
He's referring, or the founders are referring to Parliament right there.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is where he goes into, like, so when he says acts of pretended legislation, semicolon, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us. And again, the Quartering Act, this is why the Third Amendment to the Constitution, Third Amendment is essentially you can't, the government cannot quarter troops in your house. So when they brought over all these British troops, they didn't just say, okay, hey, here's your barracks and here. No. It was, we're going to bring you into Boston and hey, you family, you're now going to house these two troops as part of the regiment. And you're not only responsible for housing them, you might also be responsible for feeding them or sustaining them. So that's kind of what was going on here. For protecting them by a mock trial from punishment from any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states. That goes back into what I was saying before. Okay, there's a standing army. What happens when the soldier violates the law? Well, they're no longer tried by the state in which it took place. They're subject only to English jurisdiction. For cutting off our trade with all parts of the world. This had to do with special economic privileges that were given to like the East India Trading Company when it came to things like buying tea. From imposing taxes on us without our consent. That is your no taxation without representation. For depriving us in many cases of the benefit of trial by jury. Self-explanatory. For transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. So that was the threat of if you do something I don't like, you're not going to get tried in your own colony. We're going to ship you back to England. We'll try you here. For abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule in those colonies. Again, this was going in largely, I think, Massachusetts essentially suspending everything. And then what he's saying now is all the other colonies are watching what you're doing in Massachusetts, and we see it as a model for what you're going to do to the rest of us. For taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. So again, this is one of the things where the most important role of the crown was to protect its own citizens, and now they see him as the guy that's committing war against them. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. Again, this is talking about the acts that were going on predominantly in Massachusetts. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy, scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy of the head of a civilized nation. Think Prussians, right? The Hessian mercenaries. So if you think about what was it? Christmas 1770. Was trying to think of the raid on the Hessians, the crossing of the Delaware. The famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware to attack the Hessians. Hessians were essentially German mercenaries that were fighting on behalf of the English crown. He has constrained our fellow citizens, taking captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. Press ganging. So this is the part where a British ship would essentially stop an American merchant ship and then take the sailors and press gang them into serving in the British Navy. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions.
The wokists aren't going to like that one.
The wokists aren't going to like that one, but what he's essentially referring to is that the English, allied with Indian tribes, and Indian tribes saw independence is actually being very, very bad for them, in part because they saw the English crown as restraining westward expansion. But the thing that Jefferson is pointing out here is that, and this is not to suggest that, again, Westerners always fight in under chivalric codes, right? But the Indians' rule of warfare was win, right? So this idea of innocent women and children or anything like that. That was not a concern for many or most of the Indian tribes. And so what he's saying is he's accusing King George of allying with Indian tribes that are willing to essentially engage in massacres. Now, the obvious response to this is, well, we engage in massacres too. Okay, granted, but the point he's making is still it's a valid one. And now we get to this next part that's very, very important. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. So he's mentioning that I've just told you all the grievances. Now think of it this, hey, you know these grievances I just mentioned? With every single one of them, we still tried to be loyal subjects. We still tried to reconcile. And what's become obvious now is that no reconciliation is possible unless we surrender. And we would be surrendering to a tyrant because the very things he's doing are complete violations of what we perceive to be the natural born rights of English citizens. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity. And we have magnanimity. And we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war and in peace, friends. What's interesting to remember about this is that there were members of the British Parliament that were actually very, very sympathetic to the English colonists. Edmund Burke, represented someone that was at least philosophically, there was a huge debate that went on in Parliament about the way that the Crown was conducting themselves in the 13 colonies. But ultimately, they still ended up backing the King's play. And then we get to the final part here where it says, we therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress, assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all alliance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. I think it's interesting to point out here the emphasis on free and independent states. So while there was common cause among the colonies, now independent states, there was still very much the idea that, no, we are 13 independent states that are forming an alliance in order to conduct this war against Great Britain.
You know what's interesting?
What?
United is not capitalized.
Nope.
In United States of America. States in America is, though, in the original declaration.
There's a reason why there's a reason why before, they say that before the Civil War, it was the United States are, and after the Civil War, the United States is, because there was this idea that this was now even after the Constitution, there was still this idea. There was a great deal of emphasis put on state sovereignty. Post Civil War, far less emphasis put on state sovereignty, in part because it had then been established, not through law but by war, that you couldn't leave.
And we've only moved further in that direction with the 17th Amendment.
Yes.
And
yeah. So
a huge chunk of the Federalist, foundation of our country has been eroded over the last, really since the Civil War, but not just with the Civil War itself, which I guess kind of actually is a great segue to, do we need to update this document, which is the focus of today's episode?
Well, I guess I wouldn't say we need to update this document. I think the question is that are we once again moving in a potential direction where separation is the only thing that makes sense anymore.
Yeah, the problem though with this whole idea is it's like the idea of a national divorce, basically.
Yeah.
Which also runs in line with the idea of a civil war. And so there's no real way for us to separate from those we have grievance with, because it's not like it's marked out by boundaries. It's everybody's in and amongst each other.
Well, so let's address that for a second, because that kind of goes with the practical considerations. First of all, I want to say we got to ask the question of, before we get into the practical, we have to ask the question is, does such a, are we witnessing such a divergence with respect to the belief in who we are as a nation and where we should be going, that political division is kind of an inevitability? And I don't know that it is. I don't want it to be. I'll put it that way. I don't want us to dissolve the United States as we currently see them. But I think we are definitely, when you look at the sort of arguments that were used, there's no question in my mind that there is an ever-growing sector of the left in this country that does not see much in the way of limitations on government power. They do see that they want the government to play. We see this now in the mayoral race in New York City. So they want the government to own your grocery store. They want, and here's the comical part about that. He wants the government to own the grocery store, but there are no groceries that materialize out of thin air at the grocery store. They all come from somewhere. And when he can't get what he wants through owning the grocery store, the next logical step is, well, we got to own the farms and ranches and everything else which populate the grocery store.
Mamdani has said that he wants to seize the means of production.
Yes.
He said that that's his end state. He is a Marxist in that. I don't mean this in the rhetorical sense, right? Like, no, he would self-identify as that. Yeah. On your broader point though about, it seems like we're two separate countries. There was a really recent poll from Gallup that came out that I think is very applicable to this. This shows the pride in being an American, basically. This is from just a few days ago, and it's basically slipped to an all-time low. And what's really interesting is broken down by ideology. So this is the total number going back to 2001. And you see that in 2001, 87% of Americans were extremely or very proud to be an American. And today it's only 58%.
Yeah.
So under 60%. And what's really interesting again is it's tumbled with Democrats. With Republicans, it hasn't moved almost at all. In fact, with Republicans, it's actually gone up since 2001. From 90% to 92%. With Democrats, it's gone from 87%. So statistically tied with Republicans in 2001 to barely a third.
Yeah.
And I have.
Well, and can we point something out here? Look at the
independents. It's slid as well.
53. Can we look at the second low point there among Democrats? So the current one is 36, but in 2020, it was 42, and then it jumped up
because Biden won
to 62. All right. So I want you to keep that in mind for a moment here. The Republican numbers dipped when Biden won. Go up to that one. It dipped down to 88.
Well, it bottomed at 84.
84. There you go. Bottomed at 84. The Democrats peaked, after 2020, the Democrats peaked at what, 64? 62?
62 in 2021.
62. And again, this was kind of a trend. Like the Democrats were never as proud as Americans. This is going back to 2001. Never as proud as Republicans. But you started to see slow, declines over time.
You saw a little bit during the second Bush administration from 2004 to 2008, right?
Yeah.
And then Obama wins in 2008, and then you see Democrats recover a little bit. But look at what happens after 2015.
Yeah.
As late as 2015, as late as 10 years ago, 80% of Democrats said that they were either extremely very or they were extremely or very proud to be an American. As late as 10 years ago, 80% of them. And today it's a third of them.
Well, I think it's important to understand that how the Democrats feel about their country is tied very, very closely to who's at the helm at any given time. And here's why I think that's important, is when you see your country largely as your government. you're more likely to be proud or ashamed of your country based off of how well your government reflects your values at any given time. When you see your country as something far more than just its government, well, you have a lot more stability over how you view your country. And Republicans, in large case, don't associate their country. They make this very, very clear distinction between their country and their government. This is why you'll see that bumper sticker, right? I love my country, I fear my government. But then you saw this at one of the Democrat national conventions where they said the government is the one thing we all belong to. It becomes, now listen, if we want to give it a steelman version of what they were saying, they were not saying we all belong to the government. You were saying, well, that's the one thing that we all participate in. It's the one thing that no matter who you are or what you believe or where you live, we're all a part of this American democracy is the way they would put it. I know we're a constitutional republic. But over time, you've seen this shift even more. And again, there's a lot more philosophical underpinning than just this one thing that I'm mentioning. But I think it's an important distinction. And when we talk about when we we talk about this, dissolve the political bonds which have connected them with another and to assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station. There's been a particular political bond that has connected Americans for a long time. Now, there used to be some, things were distinguished more by states prior to the Civil War, right? That became less pronounced after the Civil War, but it still exists. We still have federalism. We still have some sort of mechanism that we use in order to push back against federal power, and it's not just federal elections, right? We have states that push back against federal power. But when you have, I would say that's a significant philosophical break, is when you have one people that largely views their country in accordance with their political system, and you have another people that looks at their country from a combination of its history, its culture, its underlying philosophical values, its religion. That's very different. That's two very, very different mindsets. And it's not that the left is unaware of American history, they just don't like it. And when you ask the left about American culture, if they say that we have a culture at all, it's racism, sexism, bigotry, oppression. So why would you expect anybody who have been taught that and believe it to be proud of their country at all, other than the one thing they can be proud of their country, because it's not our history, it's not our culture, it's not our founding. The one thing they have to be proud of is when their political party is in control.
It reminds me of what Christopher Lasch said 30 years ago when he wrote the book, The Revolt of the Elites. And he said that the managerial class, which today is the core base of the Democratic Party, they are tourists in their own country.
Yeah.
They don't have any loyalty.
They're citizens of the world.
I look at this and I'm like, 36%, I'm surprised it's not zero.
Yeah.
Because liberals are not Americans. They're liberals.
Well,
they view themselves as post-national, borderless tourists who have no loyalty to anything beyond individual self-actualization. You do you, you be you. Well, it's the whole comprehensive liberalism that I was trying to differentiate from traditional English liberalism, and when it's severed from any sort of higher calling that is outlined in our Declaration of Independence about how we're endowed by our Creator, all of these things. Well, they've stripped that long out, and all that's left is just, again, pursuing Maslow's hierarchy of needs, individual self-actualization. Well, when you take that to its logical end conclusion over a century, arguably longer than a century that this has been going on, yeah, you get to a point where there is the distinction between being a liberal and being an American. Liberals have no loyalty to our country. They support open borders. They don't identify as Americans.
Well,
and when they do, they hate
it. I don't want to get into all that just yet, because we're going to go through a potential list of grievances, just like the Declaration of Independence. Right now, we're establishing, is there a significant difference between the populations within the United States with respect to how they see their country and where they want the country to go? Because one of the biggest things to understand about this is that up to a certain point, almost every signer of the Declaration of Independence saw themselves as a natural-born Englishman. And then at some point, they didn't. At some point, they didn't see themselves that way anymore. Maybe they had started to see themselves more as a Massachusetts man or a Virginia man or a South Carolinian or whatever else it was, but they still had that commitment, and then they didn't. And the question I have is that if you look at the principles, the fundamental principles which were laid out in the Declaration of Independence on what constitutes just government, but it was also this idea that these are the things that all of us who used to see ourselves as natural-born Englishmen, these are the things that we agree on. There's plenty of stuff we don't, but we all agree on these foundational principles which are going to inform our decision for separation and our government with our respective states, right? That was the departure. I look at basic things like this, and I see two people with very, very different ideas of what America is, what it should be, and the extent to which they're going to use government in order to achieve it. And so I believe that break, that cultural tie, that break has largely taken place.
We're at the end of this process that's been going on for decades at this point.
But this is because I don't want to get into the doom side of this, okay? Again, the founders worked very, very hard to try to reconcile because they believed that was the proper course of action. They believed that the initial effort was to reconcile, not separate. So I don't want to be frivolous about this idea of where are we headed as a nation. But now that we've kind of articulated that there's a significant break in what we would call the various philosophical reasons for why we think a country should exist, where it gets its just powers from. Now, you could argue that we both believe that it still comes from the just powers of the governed. But the problem there is that, okay, but to what extent do those powers, are those powers limitless? Are they constrained? The conservative approach to this says, well, of course they're constrained. They're limited. There's checks and balances. When I look at the left, I don't know that they really believe that there should be constraints on power unless they're not in charge. Because when they're not in charge, they appeal to those constraints on power quite frequently. And when they are in charge, they could not care less. And I don't think I'm being hyperbolic when I say that. And it wouldn't be the first time. Like, go read what certain Democrat senators were saying about the United States Constitution when it was, quote, preventing FDR, our national father, from carrying out his important tasks. It's this whole rejection of limitations on power when Democrats are in charge or when the left is in charge is not something that popped up overnight. It's something they've always kind of contended with. So that's the first question. The first question is, do we all agree that we've begun to see what we might call a fundamental shift? This is no longer left and right arguing about the top marginal tax rate. This is the left and right having a fundamental disagreement about who we are and what we should be. Okay, well, if you look at the preamble, if you look at the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, we're getting closer to that mindset. Now you go into the whole idea of the laying out of the principles, right? Again, well, I shouldn't say now. We've kind of discussed that as well. But I would say that most conservatives I know look at the principles enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and say, yes, that is exactly what we think. It is what we believe. Do we believe that the left thinks those same things?
No.
Nobody can see you.
Well, they like to say they do, but here's the thing is we watched them do all of these mask mandates and even vaccine mandates during COVID. I mean, it just put them in a position to where they're fearful enough or they, trust the authorities enough and they will do the authorities' bidding for them. Here's the thing is, we saw tons of these jab mandates basically happen. Yeah. And it's hard because the libertarian side of you goes, well, these companies can choose to require it. And that's just that. They're a private company, whatever. But the government was imposing this and then the private companies were doing their bidding for them. And it was kind of like that whole, it's not required. They're not forcing you to. You just can't make a living without it. And And so it's very similar, I feel like, to some of these things. In fact, even worse, because you're losing your body autonomy. I mean, and not only that, but they took away mechanisms for you to be able to sue if you had a vaccine injury or whatever. And so, I mean, we watched all of this happen with the left, and we know exactly what they will do. I mean, they will call and report you for having too many people to your home. If you're sitting too close, I just saw a video today, like, don't forget what they did. There was a video of a funeral where they had all the seats 6 feet apart so that they could go to this funeral. And this elderly lady started crying, because it was a funeral, probably her husband.
Yeah.
And somebody took his seat and scooted it up close to her so that he could comfort her. And another one scooted close to comfort her too. So like it was probably her 2 sons.
Yeah.
And then the funeral director gets up with his freaking mask on. Like now I see these people with a mask and I'm just like, oh, you're one of those. Unless they're coughing up a lung and they look sick or something, then I'm like, okay, thanks for wearing your mask. But anyway, he goes up and like forces them apart. And just don't forget how many people died alone in a hospital room because their family couldn't come in there because everybody was just so worried.
Well,
so the point I'm making is we've already seen that they don't believe this stuff. Even if they say they believe it, their actions tell on them. They don't believe it.
I think the distinction I would make here, because if you asked anybody on the left that I know, hey, do you believe in the right to pursue life, liberty, or life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? They would all say yes. They would all say yes. Unless you're on board, right? Then you don't have any right to life, right? So if you're in the womb, no right to life. When we say liberty, well, to what extent? And we've seen to what extent they will restrain your liberties without anything that we would have traditionally associated with due process of law. They can always claim, well, emergency orders are there for a reason. Okay, but anybody would have looked at that and go, wait a second, this seems to be like the arbitrary application of the law. And we saw the difference, especially between certain blue states and certain red states, right? Where you saw this vast difference between what they thought authority should be permitted to do in order to, quote, prevent harm. And then when it comes to the pursuit of happiness, I would say this is a little bit different. We look at the pursuit of happiness with respect to freedom from government obstruction. That's where you get into things like property rights. That's when you get into things like equality before the law. I have a right to using my labor, my ingenuity, my work ethic, my property in order to pursue happiness. They look at it as not just the prevention of harm, but the provision of happiness through the state. So now the state has an obligation to, and you're seeing this increasingly like on social media, the state has an obligation to provide your health care. The state has an obligation to provide your education. The state has an obligation to provide your food. The state has an obligation to provide your housing. That is a very, the pursuit of happiness and the provision of happiness are two very, very different things with very different implications. And so when I look at the left's conception of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, I see it as being something very different from what Jefferson was talking about.
See, I look at it slightly differently because I agree with you on everything that you just said, that there's an element of the left that views their pursuit of happiness as requiring basically the state to enable that happiness. And so therefore the state has to, confiscate people's wealth and redistribute it. And the state has to provide X, Y, and Z at the expense of other people in order to enable this pursuit of happiness. But there's another element that the left will appeal to and say, no. Government intervention, well, I mean, they will cite that when it comes to abortion. Mm-hmm. The left, there's elements of the extreme left in places like San Francisco that will say, well, how dare the state tell me to put on clothes when I go outside? And the more mainstream left is, well, how dare the state tell me that I can't murder my children in the womb?
Yep.
Or, how dare the state tell me that I can't go into the women's locker room as a man?
How dare the state not pay for the abortion because now they're denying me my right to health care?
But again, even taking that aside, like that's one thing that I think all of us on the right have realized, that the left is tyrannical when it comes to, they want to use the state to forcibly confiscate people's wealth and then redistribute it to, oh, lo and behold, the left, for them to pursue whatever dreams that they have, whatever centrally planned delusions that they wish to impose on the rest of us. But there is another element of the left that is, in many respects, perverting many of the things in here. I've highlighted a couple of this from the Declaration itself. So, are endowed by their creator certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, there's plenty of people on the left that will say, my definition of the pursuit of happiness is, well, I want to identify as a woman.
Yeah.
Or I want to murder my children in the womb. And even if you took away taxpayer funding for it, they would still want those things. Even if you didn't fund it, even if you eliminated all taxpayer funding, they would still oppose outlawing abortion. They would still oppose bans on men going into women's restrooms or bans on men participating in women's sports, because they define their pursuit of happiness as going into those things. And when we try to stop them from doing that, they turn around and say, we are tyrants, that we are using the state to, again, it's how dare the state tell me to put on clothes before going outside. That is Matt Walsh, when he did his What is a Woman documentary, there was a scene in there where he's talking to, nudist protesters in San Francisco, and they're basically making that argument. That is, this is why I've said before that this is kind of the consequence of liberalism when it's divorced from
It's true.
this.
It's true
from
because extreme
their
libertarianism agrees with, hey, they shouldn't have to wear clothes and they should be able to do however many drugs they want to do, and they should be able to dance naked in front of kids, and it's up to the parents whether or not the kids see that or not.
Yeah, how does this affect you personally? It goes back to that meme. There's a meme of Rome burning, and you have one of these like progressive or libertarian, more libertine, right? Yeah. People that say, but how does this affect you personally? How does me putting on clothes or going into a woman's restroom affect you? The reason I'm bringing this up is because this is part of the fundamental rupture. The conservative and classical liberal, as much as I am critical of it, I am actually defending it right now. The conservative and classical liberal understanding of these things, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, is that they take place within a framework that presupposes this, their creator.
Yeah.
And so that carries with it certain obligations in terms of how you act and behave in the world in order to pursue these things, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That has always been the fundamental bedrock of English and American liberalism, going all the way back to the Magna Carta, going through the Glorious Revolution, the two treatises on government, the Declaration of Independence, our Constitution. There's always been an understanding that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is not, I do whatever I want free of any outside force whatsoever, otherwise that's tyranny, because that is a purely comprehensive liberalism, atomized individualism, divorced of any conception of higher calling or principle beyond whatever I want is the ultimate thing that matters in the universe. That's almost like a solipsistic view of philosophy right there. And that has not been what the classical liberal tradition has been. This is exactly why John Adams said that our Constitution is fit only for a moral and religious people and is wholly unsuited for any other. Because when you're operating within the framework of objective truth, objective morality, that's embedded within traditional religious structures, you can have classic. Again, I have said many things over the last year or two criticizing libertarianism and classical liberalism, but you can have a classical liberal, English liberal system, American libertarianism, that is pursuing these things when they're oriented around a society that practices a belief in a creator. And I think that the fundamental difference is not just that the left wants to, obviously they want to steal our money, they want to take our gun. I mean, we've talked about that at length, right? I think the fundamental difference is theological more than anything else, and that the political differences has been downstream from the fact that we have recognized that our belief system rests on certain axiomatic principles that go much deeper than just whatever system of government is in place. And the left right now is in open revolt against that metaphysical foundation. And that's the reason why you can't reconcile it, because it doesn't matter what words you change on the piece of paper. If they don't believe the fundamentals that gave birth to those words, you can change all the words you want.
Well, the interesting,
it won't change the difference.
The interesting part is when we look at that statement, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we ask ourselves where we differ with the modern left We differ starting at the fourth word. We hold these truths. We think there's such a thing as objective truth, and the vast majority of modern leftism is built off of a postmodernist framework that does not accept objective truth. Truth is all about perspective. Truth is all about what you want. And the moment objective truth stands in the way of your self-actualization, well, now it's a tyrannical imposition upon you.
It's a tool of white supremacy.
And so we need to understand that when the primary, there's other areas along there we might be able to disagree and still, perfectly coexist with one another and even thrive. When we no longer even agree on the possibility of objective truth, you now have two people groups that are moving in a very, very different direction. Where you won't be hearing conversations like this around the Declaration of Independence and the current status of culture and intellectualism within the United States? Probably in most of your public schools. That's right. You're probably going to get the, taxation without representation, rich white guys that just wanted to own slaves and didn't want to be held accountable to, build the roads. Right. But if you actually want more for your kids, well, we've got good news. Tina and I just did a 12-part series on an introduction to homeschooling. And one of the things that we go through is we take you through the various decision-making processes that we engaged in when we decided to homeschool our kids. And guess what? It was a bit of a bumpy road. We did not set up to originally do this, right? We put our kids back in public school for a year and then immediately took them back out. And so we go through our process, the reason why we made the decisions that we did. And one of the things that we really try to do in this is we try to dispel a lot of, I would say, the inaccurate information and rumors around why you're not qualified to homeschool. Because it turns out that you are one of the primary educators in your child's life. And you can't really give that up, all right? You can pass it off to other people, but you can't ignore the responsibility that you've been given as being a primary educator in your child's life. And we think you should embrace that. And having educated all three of our kids all through high school, we've actually seen a lot of the benefits, not because we got everything right, but because we were able to recapture so much of our time with our kids. And so we go over the various reasons why you might want to homeschool, to include the number one reason why we would homeschool if we had to do it all over again. So if you want to actually review that intro, go ahead and look at the link in the description, right? Go over there right now, check out the link in the description, get this free homeschooling course. The only thing we ask you to do is once you watch it, give us your feedback. Because if you would like us to invest more time in actually providing people with resources to maybe help on your own homeschool adventure, or maybe just to give you the additional resources you need to combat some of the things that your kids are getting taught at school, well, that's something we're interested in doing. But we want to know that you would like us to dedicate the time and resources to make it happen. So go check out the link in the description, check out those videos, and give us your feedback. All right.
So, Nick, do you get why I'm bringing this up and so much? Because I feel like that there's this idea, and I know that you agree with me on this, but I feel like that there's this idea within some conservative circles that, well, we just need to maybe update the Constitution, right? Like Article 5, or we just need to fix the laws. And if the words on the piece of paper are changed a little bit, if they clarify certain things, we can fix the rupture. And what I'm trying to point out when I keep harping on, it's not that we have different political worldviews. We do, but it's actually that we have different theological worldviews. Yeah. Because the right, the classical conservatives in America would look at this and say, it is not the pursuit of happiness to say, I identify as a woman and I'm going to go into women's restrooms or compete in women's sports. It is not the pursuit of happiness to say, I'm going to murder my children in the womb. It is not the pursuit of happiness to say, I'm going to go walk around the streets of San Francisco naked. That is not what this country was founded on. That's not what this document is speaking to. And yet, all of those things the left believes.
Well, here's what I would say. I think with this guy, I don't disagree that ultimately this comes down to metaphysics, right? Like this isn't just a simple question of, well, maybe if we did, whatever, popular election of senators, which we did with the 17th Amendment, right? Maybe if we did these other things and we tweaked it a little bit, it would be better. That all fits within the boundaries, even though I think the 17th Amendment was a horrible decision. That all fits within the boundaries of to create a more perfect union. So it was recognized right there in the preamble of the U.S. Constitution that we're not perfect, we're not capable of perfection, but we're constantly striving toward it. But the only way you can strive toward it is if you have a general idea of your starting point and where you're going. We don't agree on the starting point anymore. We don't agree on the basic fundamental realities of truth, of objective morality, we don't. And when you don't, it's very, very difficult to go in the same direction. One side is going to win. And so, yes, that's the issue here. And here's why it's so important to bring this up. If you look at most of the people sitting in English Parliament, regardless of how they might have voted on who is it, Lord North's decision to send troops into England, or King George's decision to suppress the rebellion without redressing the grievances, right? Almost everyone sitting in that English Parliament would have had far more in common with the signers of the Declaration of Independence than I currently have with my colleagues that sit on the other side of the aisle in the Virginia House of Delegates. Think about that for a second, right? The sign with 52 signers of the Declaration of Independence probably had a lot more in common with the English Parliament that they decide to separate from and go to war with than I do with I won't say all, vast majority of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle today, with respect to overall worldview, American history, purpose of the government, what it's supposed to do.
There is a massive theological divide, as Christian was saying. I think that this really does stem from half the country completely and utterly rejecting truth, and the truth giver, the ultimate lawgiver. And one of the reasons why I think that it seems like we're reading two totally different documents when a leftist quotes the Constitution or quotes the Declaration of Independence, they do it much in the same way that an atheist quotes the Bible to Christians.
That's an
good way
excellent
to put it.
analogy.
It's a good way to put it. Yeah,
Tina, can I steal that as a tweet?
It's selectively used to hold you accountable, but never something to hold them accountable, because they don't really believe it.
They don't believe it. But they think that if we cite it in a certain way, we can guilt you into giving us what we want, which is sometimes money or power.
Well, it would make us feel compelled because we feel bound by this.
Yeah.
We have a loyalty to it, so we're bound to it. They're not. And so they will quote it to us being like, see, you're bound to this.
Well, no, isn't it funny? Because when they quote the Bible to us, they essentially quote a book they think is a fake book written for adults who still believe in Santa Claus. And when they quote the Constitution to us, or they quote the Declaration of Independence to us, it's a bunch of old white slave owners, right? So I think that's a brilliant way that you put it on. Okay, so let's go into the list of grievances. And again, I put out a concept of a list of grievances that if I was the one writing a Declaration of Independence to essentially say, hey, look, I've just explained the moral reasons on why we're separating. We want two very, very different things, and it has now become obvious that even though we've tried to reconcile, we're not going to be able to, because we are so diametrically opposed in our worldview and our conceptions of the American founding, history, who we are, what we're at, and where we're going, right? So that's the worldview problem. But then there's a list of grievances to demonstrate, to illustrate why this worldview problem exists. And the first one I said, rejection of God, objective morality, and objective truth.
That's exactly what we were just talking about.
That's the reason why that's so important. And there's a lot of people that might agree with us on our economics, might agree with us on our politics, that would look at that and be like, Nick, I love everything about you guys except for your God stuff, right? Like I've gotten these messages before. Like, can you just leave the God stuff aside, because everything else you guys say I like. And my response always is, no, I can't. And the reason why I can't is because what I believe is rooted in the author of what I believe. And you want the book without the author, and I can't do that and be intellectually honest. It is what it is, because ultimately I do think what you believe about God will, by necessity, form the starting point of your entire worldview. And people are like, oh, that's not true. I don't believe in God. Yes, that forms the starting point of your worldview. Because if you believe in God, well, then you believe in somebody that has authority over space and time, morality, truth, someone that has authority that isn't you.
And belief in objective morality and truth is how you get into different definitions of pursuit of happiness that we were just talking about.
And it's fundamental. And what the founders would have argued at the time, because they were not all Christians, although the vast majority of them were, what the founders would have argued is that they would say they were not arguing for a specific God, which they might have been able to get away with in a 90% Christian environment, because even though they weren't going for a denomination, there was still, when they said God, almost everybody thought of a particular thing, and it was through the lens of Christianity. But what they were essentially getting at was like, look, we don't need to be partisan in our theology, provided that we can at least all agree. This is their argument, not mine, but at least all we can agree that there is a moral law and there is a moral lawgiver, and to some degree we are both subject to that. This is the whole idea, like the Nuremberg trials, right? Is there not a law above the laws of man? That's an appeal to God. That's an appeal to God. So to reject that is to reject the morality that was actually being utilized as laying out a statement of principles for what makes a government a just government. So you're now saying I reject that view of what makes a just government, and I want to go with something else. So that's my first thing. That's my first grievance that says this is irreconcilable.
Yeah, because everything unravels after that. Because even the founders that were not Christians were still deists. They still recognized an author,
and they were still operating on Christian metaphysics. I mean, look at what Thomas Jefferson writes about. And I was going to say this immediately goes into your second point, which is a rejection of reason, logic, and civil discourse. If you don't have, I've said this a few times, if you don't have moral alignment, you can't have civil discourse. Civil discourse requires moral alignment. You can put it like this. There are times where Nick and I are in total agreement. I think that Nick and I are absolutely without question in agreement about the debt's unsustainable, fiat currencies have a 100% failure rate. You need it doesn't matter what type, gold, Bitcoin, you need some sort of scarcity to back up the money, right? We're in complete alignment on that. We are not in alignment on what's the ideal organizational structure in government, right? We joke all the time. Nick brought this up on the podcast. I'm more of a monarchist. He's more of a Republican. But we can have civil discourse on talking about political solutions to problems because we start with a position of moral alignment.
Well, wait a second. I want to, because I think most people are going to hear this and they're going to feel like it falls within that first grievance that we just listed. The second grievance is rejection of reason, logic, and civil discourse is tied to what you're saying. But I would even say this. I know people that are hardcore atheists that they would say we are perfectly aligned on reason, logic, and civil discourse. Now, I would argue that we could have a very, very robust discussion on whether or not an atheistic worldview actually can make sense of reason and logic. But let's just set it aside for a second, right? Let's just set this aside for a second and acknowledge that what the modern left has done with respect to reason, logic, and civil discourse is they've created an environment where they will utilize it all the way up to a point where it no longer becomes useful, and then it gets abandoned. Logic does not have a restraining characteristic upon their argumentation. It does on mine. The reason why logic has a restraining characteristic on my argumentation is because if you can demonstrate me through either the utilization of evidence or logic that what I'm saying does not align with reality, then I'm wrong. And it doesn't matter how much I deeply believe it. It doesn't matter how much I believe it's so important to my self-actualization. I am incorrect, and I now therefore have a duty to realign my thinking with that which reflects reality. They put no such constraint anymore on their own views.
For them, reason, logic, and civil discourse are tools and weapons to get what they want until it doesn't achieve the task.
Yes.
And then they immediately abandon them and say these are tools of patriarchy, of racism, of what... It's a weapon rather than a canvas through which we actually paint, the portrait that creates civil society.
I think distinguishing it as a weapon from a tool is actually important here, because tools are generally used to construct, right? Weapons are generally used to destroy.
And when the weapon breaks, they drop it.
Right. It doesn't reason and logic does not play a constraining role on their method of argumentation.
That's a good analogy.
And the reason why that destroys civil discourse is because civil discourse requires restraining characteristics to the conversation. It requires truth to be a neutral third party to which all sides can appeal toward. But the moment you deny that,
it goes back to the postmodernist thing.
Well, now it's just a question of who's going to win, and ultimately this is a question of might makes right. The third grievance They have rejected a freedom of speech and association.
This should be obvious.
When you, again, because they have elevated the prevention of harm, and again, it's a very, very selective elevation of the prevention of harm, because they've elevated such a level, because they've elevated this obscure notion of tolerance to such a level, insofar as my speech causes you discomfort, I have now violated their superior principle of tolerance. And now I cannot be tolerated, right? That's their whole paradox of tolerance argument. And the way they structure it, the way they justify it is the moment you say anything which might constrain another person's ability to do what they want or express themselves they want, whatever it is, well, now you're the oppressor. Oppressors are bad. Oppressed are to be defended. And so now your speech must be constrained, right? So again, if you're going to, again, it goes into this whole idea of, if you now have the ability to shut down my speech the moment you don't like it, or the moment you find it intolerant, well then, just like I said before, you've rejected reason, you've rejected civil discourse. Now I don't even get to speak as a result, and you feel perfectly morally justified in restricting that speech. Next one, rejection of the rule of an equality before the law. They very obviously do not believe in equality before the law.
And they don't believe in the rule of law either. Although they will, just like some of these other things, they will appeal to it when it suits their ends.
Yeah.
And the second that it doesn't, again, they will drop it instantly, because notice how there's a trend here. All of this stuff is just boiling down to ruthless, zero-sum, hardline politics.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the acquisition and wielding of raw power.
Yes.
Is where it's all going. Like
well, you saw this within, this is a core tenet of critical theory. This is where critical theory purports to throw out things like logic and reason. This is why you saw the Smithsonian at the Black History Museum listing linear thought and the scientific method as attributes of whiteness, because everything is a tool for the wielding of power, to include language, right? And it never seems to occur to them. I once had this experience in an English course in college, where they were appealing to deconstructionism and Derrida, and it was this idea that, well, all language is used as a tool of manipulation. I said, that's interesting. Does that include the language you just used to tell me that? Does it include the language in this book that was just used to inform me of this particular principle of deconstructionism? Again, it's the universal solvent. They have, but again, what it does translate into, it's like they will appeal to equality before the law, but ultimately they're constantly trying to use the law in order to address what they call social injustice.
This is also why everything that we uphold is neutral and absolutely necessary in order to maintain civil society. They don't respect any concept of neutrality either. This is why one of the things that I keep bringing up is that neutrality is a myth or a lie, not because I don't want it to be. I think there's a lot of things in here that in a normal functioning society, going back to English liberalism or the American Foundation, there were a lot of things that we thought were objectively neutral frameworks through which we adjudicate things. But if the left rejects that neutrality, they then weaponize the neutrality against us, because we still want to adhere to the rules, to the processes, to the spirit of the law.
This is where you end up with federal agencies that are supposed to carry out what we would refer to as a neutral task, funding, gender ideology in Uganda with our tax dollars, right? Because we looked at it as, oh, there's this neutral function that's supposed to be pushed in order to advance U.S. interest or in order to help U.S. allies. And they said, yes, and the way we're going to do that is by funding LGBTQ ideology in Uganda. All right, the next one is the rejection of private property. This is one that is becoming more and more prominent.
Look at New York City.
New York City, again, the fact that the Democrats nominated him and that he probably has the best chance of winning, we'll see what happens. But it is this idea that there is a fundamental rejection that is taking place of the notion of private property. And what's interesting is whenever I point this out, I will get people on the left, my colleague, that's ridiculous. We still believe in private property, but, and this is where you get into redistribution. This is where you get into the government control through regulations and cartels. This is where you get into the government dictating what companies should do, what they should prioritize. And that's the point that I remind them, like, yes, I'm not saying you're all economic communists. Some of you are economic fascists, because that's the distinction. The socialist believes in the abolition of the private ownership of the means of production. The fascists are okay with limited private ownership of the means of production, provided it is operating in accordance with the dictates of the state. So yes, pick your poison. I know leftists who are Marxists and socialists, and I know leftists who prefer economic fascism. But I know very, very few at this point that I would categorize as genuinely capitalist or in favor of free markets. So the rejection of private property is why I said that. The rejection of self-defense.
This is also obvious.
This goes into the whole concept of we're going to disarm you. And because even when you look at Democrats who will argue for limited gun ownership, it's never from the perspective of self-defense. It's always from the perspective of either collecting or sport. Because they don't want to make it about self-defense, because after all, that's the job of the government.
And if we want real life examples of this, look at what the left tried to do to Kyle Rittenhouse. Look at what they tried to do to Daniel Penny. Now, both of those guys won their trials, but the left tried to basically throw them in prison for life.
Yeah.
For their actions that the juries ended up concluding were taken in self-defense. And for every two, those are two famous names, but there's dozens, if not hundreds, of other less famous examples of this.
Let me give you a very, very basic example. I promise you that for the vast majority of you that have your kids in any sort of public school, public institution of education, if your kid gets in a fight, even if they didn't start it, they're both getting in trouble. They're both getting in trouble. Well, we have a zero tolerance policy. Yes, you're right. You have a zero tolerance policy for self-defense. Why? Because you've decided it's either more expensive because of potential lawsuits, or it's too difficult to try to figure out who was responsible for starting the fight. And so the general rule is anybody fighting, you both get in trouble. I remember the year I sent my kids back to public school, and my daughter was in 5th grade, who had a student that was threatening to beat her up, and sitting there and staying up with her and helping, teaching her how to fight, how to throw a punch, how to block. Well, Dad, and I remember her telling me, Daddy, I'll get in trouble. I said, you let me worry about that part. No institution has the right to tell you you're not permitted to defend yourself. And yet, that is the predominant viewpoint within the left. You do not have a right to self-defense. They'll say it on some levels, but when they're trying to when they start off with teaching your kids that the answer is to always run to an authority figure, and then as you get older, they take away your means for defending yourself, there's no question that they have fundamentally rejected a right to individual self-defense. A rejection of federalism. Again, I think this one is obvious. Does anybody here honestly believe that if they could get away with it, the left would essentially gut the 9th and 10th Amendments to the Constitution?
Well, they've already done it with, I would argue, this has been a centuries-long process. You have the Civil War, and then you had the 17th Amendment, and you just brought this up. The 16th Amendment is also an attack on federalism.
The 16th Amendment provides the federal government a mechanism to basically impose their will constitutionally. So it used to be the biggest constraint on the federal government was they didn't have a number of taxing mechanisms beyond things like tariffs and some other limited taxing mechanisms. And they were bound by Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. When you get into the progressive era, all of a sudden you have this very, very liberal interpretation of the general welfare clause, where now it's like, well, as long as the federal government is doing something in the quote, the general welfare, they can do whatever they want. If that was true, you wouldn't have Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution listing out specific enumerated powers. And yet, I will watch the left make the general welfare clause argument. Now, the general welfare clause argument without the 16th Amendment is effectively worthless because you wouldn't have sufficient funds to be able to do all the things that you're trying to do. But the moment we gave the feds the ability to tax income, regardless of states, because it used to be, that was a limiting factor. The moment you did that, now they can say, okay, I'm going to take your money, and the only way you get it back is if you do what I want.
So now with the abandonment of the gold standard, though, you could argue that even if you got rid of the 16th Amendment, the feds would still have that ability because they can just, the Fed can simply print the money. But on that point, the attack on federalism is just, it's an endless assault. I jokingly brought up on a previous podcast many months ago that, if we tried to leave and I know that I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here, but if we tried to leave, the left would not let us because the trans youth of Mississippi must be liberated.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's very true. That part of the reason that they attack federalism is because they view federalism as a shield to prevent their progressive reshaping of humanity from spreading everywhere. This is also why you're starting to see a marriage between neocons and progressives.
Yeah.
Notice how a lot of the old neocon writers from like 20 years ago during the Bush era have now come out, and they're basically Democrats. Like Bill Kristol is going out there tweeting about transgenderism now.
Yeah. Oh no, it's crazy. The next one I want to go over is the rejection of the traditional family and the complementary roles of men and women in society. And this again goes back to, you could say that this is a question of just objecting or rejecting objective reality. But the reason why I say the traditional family specifically is because if you look at all the various mechanisms that they've attempted to use through the welfare state, through the education system, there has been a very, very consistent process whereby they are systematically dismantling the importance and necessity of the family. And the latest manifestation of that is the whole trans movement. The latest manifestation of that, this whole idea that not only are we rejecting husband and wife, mother and father, we're rejecting the categories themselves. And that is because our society is built off of the belief that things start with the individual, but the individual always starts with the family. The individual is the creation of the family. Right? Because we've always looked at that as the building block of civilization, and because they fundamentally reject that as the building block of civilization. In fact, they look at it as a positive impediment. And this goes back to the whole Marxist approach to society. It's fascinating to look at an article in the in the Wall Street Journal, where they're talking about the communist Chinese government, and they're criticizing this. The communist Chinese government is setting up early child daycare. Now, why would they criticize that?
Yeah, I thought they're all about paid family leave.
Because the purpose of it is to get Tibetan children away from their families as early as possible, and then to indoctrinate them into the Chinese language, Chinese culture, at the detriment of Tibetan culture, in order to ensure that the next generation of Tibetans are not fighting out, that there are no free Tibet stickers, right? So this idea of the Marxist approach that having children and raising children is essentially a community project, right? It takes a village. Okay, there's two different ways to look at that. You could say that, yes, it takes an extended family to be able to benefit and foster and create the best growth possible, but it's family, not just some random village. And their extension of it is no, it's the state. Because the only way that we're going to ever create the perfect socialist man that can implement all of these policies is that if the state is responsible for educating, because the parents might have different ideas.
This is a topic that should be explored further. There needs to be a distinction made between organic communities that have existed, as long as civilization has existed, and the modern state. Mm-hmm. And the left confuses those two. They always have. But a more traditionalist conservative interpretation would not necessarily disagree with the idea that maybe it does take a village in a traditionalist sense of the term, not in a modernist 21st century state management where you're going to set up government programs. You're going to have, unelected bureaucrats who don't know these people. Yeah. That's the whole violation of the principle. The idea that it takes a village is the idea that you know the villagers. Yeah. And that you have that organic bond. But part of the thing that the left wants to do is dissolve those organic bonds and replace them with state-imposed bonds. Yes. Because organic bonds aren't chosen, right? They're inherited. This is why the left uses language like assigned families.
Well, and John Dewey, who is one of the authors of the modern public school system in America, John Dewey really pushed, and he did this through scientific research, whereas the earlier you could get your children away from the family and put them into some sort of educational setting, you could dissolve family bonds and create peer group bonds. So the bonds were going to
it's a lot easier to manipulate those.
The bonds were going to exist one way or another. And his objective was to remove the family bonds and create the peer bonds, the peer group bonds. And he's been highly successful in the mechanism that he used. The next one is the rejection of the sanctity of human life and the defense of children. This is another one where I think that, as generally speaking, all societies, or I shouldn't say all, a society which rejects the sanctity of human life. And I'm sorry, but the moment you say that this stage of human life is no longer sacred, or this stage of human life can be arbitrarily killed at the behest of somebody else, you have fundamentally undermined the sanctity of human life. And that's why the same societies which will push abortion for any reason up till month 9 will also push assisted suicide for essentially any reason you can conceive of. When you also combine that with this kind of radical environmentalism, which is the idea that we're humanity itself is the problem, you shouldn't be surprised when the overall conclusion is, yeah, there is no sanctity of human life. We're essentially a parasite on the earth, or we're a parasite on the mother, or we're a parasite on an overtaxed healthcare system.
It's extremely nihilistic.
Exactly. And the defense of children. I added that in there because this is not a new phenomenon. First of all, when you look at ancient paganism, there was, you had child sacrifice. But now what we see is not only the child sacrifice in the form of abortion, and when I mean sacrifice in the terms of, I want to do certain things, I made a decision, that decision had consequences. Those consequences prevent me from doing something else I want, therefore I will sacrifice the child to my preferences. I will acknowledge I'm responsible for my actions, but the child gets sacrificed to other preferences. That's what's happening. The other thing that's taking place here, and this has to do with the trans movement, but it also has to do with what we're seeing with things like minor attracted persons. And keep in mind here, the same existentialists, postmodernists, critical theorists, feminists that were pushing all of those ideologies were the same people that were writing letters to French newspapers in the 70s saying that they needed to drastically alter the age of consent downward. Why? Well, because if they're an autonomous human being that is seeking self-actualization, who are you to infringe on their rights of association and experimentation with their body? That's the argument they were making. By the way, if you don't think this, if you don't, well,
this is real.
That was in France, Nick. Okay. Go to any university in the United States in the West, in any one of those departments, and look for Foucault, look for Sartre, look for Derrida, look for Simone de Beauvoir. They're all there. The very classes which are teaching your children how to think about the world are all heavily influenced by the same people that were writing those letters. And then you want to look in the United States, look at Kinsey, look at money. This whole idea of transgenderism, of the idea of promoting and essentially saying that any sort of sex that is consensual, and remember, they're trying to lower the age of consent, is perfectly acceptable. It's just a healthy expression. Go look at Kinsey's book on the tables of the people that he was using and he was experimenting on for his subject matter.
Yeah. Babies as young as 6 months old.
He ages them by months, not years, ladies and gentlemen. These are the people that the sexual liberation movement in the United States were appealing to. John Money, when he was pushing his whole idea of gender, when he was pushing his whole idea of the idea that it's all about nature, it's all about nurture, not nature, and that essentially gender was just a social construct, go look at the two boys that he used as the experiment. Now, you can't talk to him today because both of them committed suicide. But you can read about what he did to them. And the fact that he is actually respected and read in academic journals and scientific journals, as opposed to rotting in a prison somewhere before he died, that would have been the appropriate course of action. And yet there it is. So when I say that they have rejected the sanctity of human life and the defense of the innocence of children, I absolutely 100% mean it. And yes, your neighbor who votes for every progressive under the sun, who's waving free Palestine flags, yeah, they may be horrified if something did something inappropriate to their child. But I have this question. I've asked it before. I have this question of progressive fathers because I've sat there in the subcommittee meeting as I have watched a progressive politician with daughters sit there and excoriate Riley Gaines as doing nothing more than picking on people that are different from them. And I had to stop the committee and instruct them that they would no longer treat witnesses in that manner. But the thing I really wanted to say, and perhaps should have at that point, is really, I've got a question. If your 14-year-old daughter came home from high school gym class saying that I was forced to sit there and undress in front of a boy, what would your response be to her, Dad? Would it be to tell her to stop being a bigot? Would it tell her to stop being a sexist? Would you shame your daughter for feeling a sense of uncomfort that is justifiable so you can prop up your own political ideology? And the answer may be in that individual situation, no, but he's more than happy to impose it on the rest of us through law. So yes, they have absolutely rejected the sanctity of human life in the defense of innocent children. The next one is the rejection of the sovereignty of borders. Now, this is an interesting one because it goes back to everything else we've been saying. They have no problem appealing to the sanctity of borders when it comes to certain nations, just not our own. They completely appreciate Iran's right to enforce their borders, secure their borders, and apply whatever laws they want within. But when it comes to our borders, when it comes to the border of Western countries, our borders are to be completely ignored. Our borders are arbitrary. Our borders are unjust. Why? Because they were established by oppressors. And any border established by oppressors, or any border which seeks to actually protect Western civilization, is therefore illegitimate. I think that speaks for itself. The last one I'll say is the rejection of the philosophy of individual liberty combined with personal responsibility. And this is where we go into the whole idea of our rights versus their rights, negative rights versus positive rights. When we talk about rights, we are generally talking about you have rights, which are essentially restrictions on an outside force compelling you to do something, namely the government. So when you have the freedom of speech, that doesn't mean the government is obligated to give you the mechanisms of speech. It means the government cannot pass laws or engage in activities which infringe upon it. Same thing with your religion. When we say you have freedom of religion, we don't mean the government has to provide you a religion or a church. When we say you have freedom of the press, we don't mean the government has to provide you with a printing press. When we say that you have the right to keep and bear arms, we don't mean that the government has the obligation to use taxpayer funds to provide you guns. Now, when you talk about rights from the left-wing perspective, all of a sudden it's you have a right to housing, you have a right to health care, you have a right to food, you have a right to clothing, you have a right to opportunity. Well, what does all that do? It obligates somebody else. You'll notice that none of the rights we talk about, none of the negative rights obligates anybody to do anything except leave other people alone in the free exercise of their rights. But every single one of the rights they appeal to provides an obligation on somebody else to give up of their own time, talent, or property in order to satisfy that right. Not to mention that they come up with other rights that are just impossible to achieve. I once sat with a very intelligent Democrat legislator, and she looked at me and she goes, Nick, I have a bill which is going to prevent anybody from being able to conceal carry on the General Assembly grounds. Because it used to be when I first got there, if you had a concealed carry permit, you can conceal carry. And I said, well, I don't think I'm going to support that. And she goes, well, Nick, does your right to keep and bear arms trump my right to feel safe? And I looked at her and I said, I don't think that's the argument you want to use. And she goes, well, why not? I said, so you're saying that the government has an obligation to protect your right to feel safe? Yes. Well, then presumably the government has an obligation to protect my right to feel safe. She goes, yes. I'm like, good. I only feel safe if I can have a belt-fed weapon. And if you don't provide me a belt-fed weapon, you're infringing on my right to feel safe. Right? And to her credit, she looked at me and she goes, okay, I see what you're saying. Now, I will tell you this. She saw what I was saying in that moment because someone was there to present the contradiction. I promise you, when she went back to her district, she talked about all of our right to feel safe. It's impossible. They come up with rights that are either absolutely impossible or they come up with rights that by their very existence, if they could exist, infringe on the rights of somebody else. If the right you're appealing to automatically infringes on my right, it can't be a right because someone now has to suffer in order to provide it.
In some ways, it's even worse than that because as you have pointed out, and I've been in some of these speeches where you've pointed this out, the left also wants things like, for example, they will advocate for legalizing all drugs. You know, Portland style, Oregon style drug laws, which they passed a few years ago, and then they recently reversed some of them. And then in the same breath, they will say, and I want taxpayer, subsidized healthcare.
Yeah. The government
I want you to pay for it.
The government should not tell me what to put in my body, but the moment I put something in my body that harms me, even if I knew it would harm me, you're now financially obligated to support it. You now have to make me better.
That's why you said individual liberty combined with personal responsibility, because individual liberty divorced from personal responsibility goes right back to what I was talking about earlier with comprehensive liberalism. That's libertine, not liberty.
Yeah,
well, there is no individual liberty without personal responsibility, because if you can do whatever you want regardless of consequences and everyone else has to pay for your consequences, then they don't have individual liberty. So
it's self-defeating.
It is self-defeating.
Yeah.
But no, the left believes that. That's the peak of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Individual self-actualization cannot be achieved unless you pay and you're obligated to shoulder the burdens of me pursuing my self-actualization.
Yes. And it's amazing because you look at them like, well, don't you recognize, though, that by you requiring me to finance or support your pursuit of happiness, you necessarily infringe on mine? To which the response is, that's okay, you're an oppressor. Or that's okay, you're wealthy, you have stuff I don't have. And since egalitarianism and equality is the chief virtue that we're trying to achieve here, we can now take from you to equalize. So that's the list of grievances that if I had to write a Declaration of Independence, if we ever found ourselves at a point where it's like, okay, we're not doing this anymore, these would be the fundamental grievances that I would lay down. And I'm sure there's other ones that we could mention, but these are the ones that as I looked at everything that causes me to look at the other side and say, I don't know that we can reconcile this. I didn't pick ones like, obviously there's a lot of stuff with taxes or regulations or whatnot, but all of those things are inherent to the grievances I'm laying down here, because what it speaks to is the idea that if this is what you believe about the family, about reality, about borders, about defense of children, if this is what you believe, I don't see any argument that I can make that can convince you to not believe these things, especially when the very first thing I talked about was a rejection of God, objective truth, objective morality, and then the second, reason, logic, and civil discourse. If this is all an adjudication of power, you leave me with one of two options. I can try to leave, or I can win. But how do these worldviews peacefully coexist with one another? Theoretically, if my worldview is dominant, you can still do pretty much all you want. You just have to take responsibility for your own actions. And that is a price you're not willing to pay.
But if their worldview is dominant, you wouldn't be able to live your life at all.
Not even close.
And we've seen multiple examples throughout history of their worldview being dominant, and none of them are a happy story. No. I think that you're right, ultimately, that they can't coexist. And this is why we're increasingly turning into two states within one. Mm-hmm. I mean, it goes back to the pride in being an American. The chart showing that it's only 36% of Democrats say that they have that they're proud to be an American, whereas it's 92% of Republicans. You can't have a country with a gap this large, where half of the country basically hates the country that they're in, and the other half still identifies as Americans. These people, goes right back to what I was saying earlier about that quote from Christopher Lasch, the professor from 30 years ago. These people are tourists in this country, but they're voting in our elections, even though they have no loyalty to this country, and they don't even think the country should exist. If they had their way, they would dissolve the borders. They would dissolve the identity of this country, and they would say, we're all just going to be happy, gay race communists, and, live and let live, and as long as you pay for all of it, right? Like, you can't have a society or a civilization operate that way. When these groups, when the Republican group says, no, I am an American, and that means I believe in certain things, and that also means that I respect certain limitations on my actions, on society's actions. We're not going to have a total state. I'm not going to tell you what to live and let live, but you also have some obligations. That means no transing of the kids, no going into women's bathrooms, no walking around naked, no public drug use, all those type of things that we think are just normal.
Yeah.
And then these people say America's evil. It's a patriarchal, white supremacist, settler colonial state. We need to dissolve the borders. You're a bad guy because of your race and gender. And I don't believe in any of this stuff. And it's just individual self-actualization. And I just want to steal from you in order for me to fund my nihilistic hedonism.
Well, and this goes into the final part of this. And that is kind of the idea of the conclusion, right? The denunciation and conclusion. I don't want my country to break apart. I really don't. I hope that there is a path forward in this, but there's only 3 paths that I can see that are available right now. One is the left still maintaining many of their viewpoints on their own personal decisions that they want to make, what we might call private decisions. But understanding that they don't get to impose those decisions on others, either through compelling people to participate or compelling people to finance, which is a form of participation. They're going to have to accept limitations on government power to achieve their objectives. If they can adopt a version of their belief system which emphasizes cooperation rather than coercion, there may be some mechanism forward. I don't know that they're capable of that anymore, which leads me to the other 2 options. The other is one side wins. Either they win and now I'm subject to what they want, to which case I will tell you right now I'm not going to comply, or we win, and the version of how we win can vary greatly. There's one version of how we win that says, okay, you refuse to engage in cooperation versus coercion, now we're going to force you to. There's another version that says, you're not welcome here anymore. That's just reality. That's what happens when things actually go to blows. The third option is what we refer to as the national divorce component. It's the independence. You notice they didn't do the declaration of conquest over Great Britain and its colonies. They did independence. You go your way, we're going to go ours. That's the third option. So either the left can either reevaluate the way that they think about achieving their goals, and they can attempt to do it through logic and civil discourse. I think the reason why they've rejected logic and civil discourse is because they can't win under those parameters. They can't win under cooperation versus coercion. The other title is they end up losing, but again, how they lose is going to matter. If I'm the one in charge when we win, that's going to look very, very different than if, Nick Fuentes is in charge. God help us. But then that third it's the divorce. It's the idea that, you know what? You get to do whatever you want with California, Oregon, and Washington State, but you don't touch the rest of us. I don't know. We'll see what happens. What I really, really hope is that, and this is the thing that gives me hope, because if we just look at the common trends that have taken place over the last several decades, there's not a lot to be hopeful for, save one. And that is the number of people that because of COVID looked around and saw for the first time what was actually happening right beneath the surface, because it busted through to the open. And those people decided, those young men have decided, we're going back to church. We're looking for something true. We want to fight for something honorable and noble. We don't just want to be free. We want to be free to live honorable lives and raise honorable families. The number of parents that are saying, I'm going to start taking more control over my child's education. I'm not going to trust institutions, whether it be Hollywood or whether it be academia or the government. I'm not going to trust that they have my best interest in mind. And so that skepticism combined with action is what I see starting to take place. And some of it's manifested in election results, but so much more of it is manifested in just the individual decisions people are starting to make. And that's where you're starting to see the pushback in those areas, those areas that shape culture. Whether it's entertainment, social media, and information, where it used to be dominated by Hollywood and the legacy media, and now it isn't. The legacy media has gone down pretty hard lately. pretty hard. When it comes to the arts and entertainment, you're starting to see a revival over there too, but it's not happening in studios in Hollywood. It's happening with independent creators. Right? When you start to see the church, what I already mentioned, it's young men once again going back in there and saying this is ground we want to fight for. And so we're starting to see that take place. And I think that's a very positive thing. And it does give me a great deal of hope. But the good news with all of this is that hopefully one day we won't have to do another Declaration of Independence. Hopefully what will happen is enough people will read the original one, recognize the inherent truth within, recognize the beauty of what was trying to be achieved, and once again recognizing that it was also us admitting that we're not perfect, that no system of government is perfect. But if we can keep our eyes pointed to what is true and recognize an obligation to not only fight for freedom, but the personal responsibilities which actually make it possible, then we can actually come up with a pretty great place to live. And I hope the legacy of this generation will be to live up to the legacy of past ones. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. Please have a wonderful Independence Day. And no matter what else is going on, remember this. One of the greatest things that our founders gave us was the ability to actually participate in this process. We do get a say in what sort of country we're going to be. And I plan to have mine. Not just out of a desire to achieve what I want, but out of a sense of responsibility that everyone that came before me. Once again, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next episode.